The history I have with horror and its many types of subgenre is pretty rough. Despite the title of this video, the horror genre is actually hands down one of my favorite forms of media I consume. However, despite that, I can admit that the genre is oversaturated with many terrible films, games, and television shows that use cheap scare tactics to give the audience a little jump. I'll admit, jump scares do sometimes get me, but that's all it does, it just gets me. You'll be surprised the amount of bad horror movies that are on Netflix's library that hold some of the worst scores you'll ever see. And for some odd reason, they just keep pumping out these titles. But despite everything I just said, when a horror movie is done well, it's some of the best works of art you'll ever see. Movies like The Babadook and the original Paranormal Activity are some of my favorites of all time. Specifically The Babadook because the movie somehow builds a scary atmosphere with almost never actually seeing the creature for majority of the movie. Now let's relate this topic to video games. I think when it comes down to video games, generally being scared by one is kind of a hard thing to accomplish. I'm just not a big fan of horror video games. I personally don't think many of them do a good job of scaring me. Now, I'm not saying horror games are awful, I'm just saying that I don't really enjoy them for the horror aspect. And some of them do a pretty awful job at it. So today I want to discuss my dissatisfaction with modern day horror games and explore why or why not these games fail to make me and some other people scared. Anyways, my name is Quasi and this is Just a Game. What entices fear? Now depending on the person, the answer might be different. Here's another question. Why do we seek out horror media? I think this question has been asked but never really fully explored. I think that we tend to gravitate towards genre of media that some way are relatable but at the same time unattainable. This is why genres like sci-fi, thrillers, and action adventure are some of the most popular movie genres alongside with horror. I think when it comes to fear, it's one of the most uncomfortable feelings, so if you experience fear from watching something that actually isn't there, it kind of gives an adrenaline rush through the whole entire body. This rush is what me and many other people seek from horror, and it's something only horror can effectively do. The feeling after watching a really engaging horror film where you can barely sleep at night and everything looks like it's from the movie you just watched is really what the genre is all about. So effectively, horror and thrillers are one of my absolute favorite types of media, whether it be anime, manga, video games, or movies. But because of how elaborate producers and filmmakers have to be to create fear in their films, many of them just fail, and when a horror medium fails to scare, the entire project won't hit for a lot of people. Look at the majority of the worst rated films on Netflix or even in general, majority of them are horror or thrillers. I've noticed that there's a lot of people out there who just push out horror films with the intention to get quick money. And you can tell by just looking at the production. And it really sucks because it's not that difficult to make a decent horror film. Okay, enough about movies and television, let's talk about video games. I mean, that's the whole point of the video, right? But before we start, let's talk about my early days with horror video games. Panning back to my early days of the horror genre, it really came from the small flash games that I used to play from websites like Newgrounds, Y8. Although majority of these games were low quality, some of them were really good. I bring this up because it's crazy to see how the rise of indie titles such as the ones I used to play on those websites have evolved. I personally think that indie titles have really revolutionized the horror genre, with some iconic titles that bring so much innovation to the table that many AAA companies can't seem to get right. Now understand this, there are bad indie horror games, but I can say the ones that I've either played or seen playthroughs for are actually pretty good. But what I've come to terms with is that I just can't play majority of these games to completion. And I just don't really find them all that entertaining. For some odd reason, I can never play Five Nights at Freddy's for more than an hour. Heck, even recently, I was playing some horror indie games for another Halloween video I had planned, and I literally couldn't play Pages of Slender for more than 30 minutes. Now I know this is really an unpopular opinion, but hopefully as we dive deeper into this video, you can kind of get a sense of where I'm coming from. When it comes down to horror in video games, the idea that you can control the events and characters around you kind of gives the whole experience a different feel. Things happen solely based on the decisions you make, and in a way, that is kind of immersive. But here's the first issue I have with this, because majority of these games involve player interaction, so some developers take every opportunity to throw as many jump scares in the game as possible, to make it more scary. And personally, yes, jump scares do have an effect on me, but that effect is only there for a short period of time, before I'm just like, I'm not scared anymore. I don't necessarily reflect on jump scares and go, wow, damn, that was really scary. It's more like, oh wow, they got me, time to move on. To me, the ideal horror game makes you terrified of the world, the characters, and the environment. I think being terrified of a story can hold much more success than banking on scaring players with cheap jump scares. This is why I stopped playing Five Nights at Freddy's after the first game. The game is unique for an indie game, but I feel like the mechanics get tiring after a while. It just consists of you flipping through security cameras with some jump scares here and there. Although the lore of the game is by far the best thing about the game, looking at all the fan theories and storylines that the fan base has come up with really gives the game more depth. However, in-game, the story is really hidden. You have to go out your way to uncover the lore. And I feel like if the lore of the game was more incorporated with the gameplay, I think the game would be way more scary, and I probably would have continued playing it. Also, gameplay for some horror games are a big problem to me. Now, this might be controversial, but I honestly can't stand the defenseless horror games where the game might give you nothing but a lamp or a flashlight, and it's just a game of cat and mouse as you try to escape from monsters. And the biggest offender is Amnesia. I remember when the game was getting so much hype from the community, with big content creators like PewDiePie making it very popular. But I feel like I was a small minority that just couldn't get into it, which is strange because at the time when I played it, I was so young and everything scared me. Literally at the point, the scariest movie I watched at the time was Jennifer's Body. Yes, the movie with Megan Fox. But going back to Amnesia, I think it's because of how slow Amnesia takes to actually get going. And with the problem I had with Five Nights at Freddy, you have to go out your way to get some kind of grasp of the story. So the story of Amnesia is actually pretty decent. Even though I didn't finish the game, I found myself browsing through YouTube looking at story summaries of the game. I vividly remember that it took like a full hour of walking around before you saw the first creature, and yes, the jump scare got me, but literally all the creatures look the same. So whenever they try to get to another jump scare, it just wasn't the same and I never really fell for it. Now this isn't really a problem from all games of this caliber, but Amnesia is a pretty long game, or at least that's how it feels. The original game will probably take you like 6 to 12 hours to beat, which in actuality it isn't that long, but geez man, 6 to 12 hours of just running and hiding from creatures with no way to defend yourself is just kind of boring, especially when the game doesn't make me feel anxious or scared as it should be. Maybe I just have tough skin where it takes a lot to scare me, but with video games, specifically with the horror genre, you have to also make the gameplay fun, so at least gamers could stay for a reason. Now, I don't just want to shit all over Amnesia because the game is outdated, but however, they did just release another Amnesia game called Amnesia Rebirth, which I do plan on getting into, so hopefully the issues I had with the original might not be present and actually make this game playable. So the title of this video is why I don't really like horror games. Emphasis on really, because I don't hate the genre. I just find it hard to find horror games that generally scare me and at the same time are really fun to play. With that being said, there are some horror games that I generally like and I don't want this video just to be completely negative, so I would like to discuss some of them. Okay, Outlast is one of the most interesting horror games out there. I'm a huge fan of the lost footage type of films like Paranormal Activity and Blair Witch Project, so the whole night mode video recorder gimmick really stuck out to me. Now, Outlast really suffers from some of the things that I mentioned earlier, like leaving you defenseless, but the story and the lore aspect of the game really sticks out. Remember how I said horror games need to bring more to the table than just jump scares to create a spooky setting? Well, I think Outlast really nails this. The story is really engaging, and you don't have to look for letters to get an idea of the lore of the story. The story literally plays out right in front of you, and although it's cliche, there were moments that generally shocked me and plot twists that I didn't even see coming. I also like how the game kind of puts everything in front of you. This tactic really brings out the spookiness within the environment. I like how the game scatters the patients all around the hospital and put them in rooms that you can't enter, but you can see the patients through the window. This really adds to the depth of the world and lets the story shine a little bit better. Story really can help boost the scare factors of horror. I recently played Resident Evil for the first time with the recent remakes, and I see why so much people hold this series to such a high standard, but honestly, I don't really find this series scary at all. Like, I can go to sleep peacefully right after playing some of these games. But I really find the gameplay fun with the whole resource management idea, and the story is so intricate that learning the little things about the characters and the world is one of the best feelings ever. I feel like the Resident Evil series is more of an action thriller game than it is a horror, and it just so happens to have zombies. It's almost kind of like Doom, but a little more toned down. Just think about how much things blow up in the game and all the type of crazy weapons you can get. But I think with Resident Evil 7 they went full on with the horror aspect, and honestly, I think it's one of the best ones story-wise. It's genuinely scary, and I actually liked all the characters, and it was really interesting to find out more about the Baker family. Facing off with each of the family members was one of the best and most intense boss battles within the franchise. Now I know some people might disagree with me saying that Resident Evil isn't necessarily a scary series, but honestly, it's just my opinion, it's just how I feel. And like I said, I think Resident Evil 7 is one of the most successful when it comes down to horror. When it comes to horror, I think I've stressed enough that the concept of story and the world building is so essential to making the medium effective. Making scary looking character designs and throwing jump scares at every corner does not all of a sudden make something scary. And because I have such an emphasis on story, I've come to enjoy a piece of horror media that I never really thought I'd find myself playing, and that's the horror visual novels. I remember playing Doki Doki Literature Club for the first time. Going into it, the only thing I heard about the game was how dark it gets, but of course I didn't take none of that serious because just look at the cover art. Come on. I'm supposed to believe this is dark, but as you play the game and get more invested to the characters, The game's story begins to unravel and it gets more and more uncomfortable. I think the game really sets the mood and the atmosphere with how they change up on the soundtrack and the background music. I like how they have upbeat tracks and then they take the same tracks and might play in reverse or play in a different key, making it sound more ominous. All these factors weigh in to make a really interesting experience. And Doki Doki is literally one of the most basic types of horror visual novels. There are so many out there that do a way better job, like The Song of Seiya. Personally, I like how well written horror games really stick out to me and many other people. But then I look at horror books and stories and how they somehow create the same sense of horror with little to no pictures. Books like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz can create vivid imagery by focusing on the environment and the character interaction. It kinda sucks that the movie version of the same books kinda sucked. Now I want to end with this. What you find scary and what I find scary is gonna vastly differ depending on what type of media you have watched or like to consume. I think that a show like Shiki can give off some really good horror vibes with the contrast between what is good and what is evil, despite the entire show being animated. But on the other hand, you might find the haunted house level in Sonic Heroes to be one of the most scariest video game levels ever. And by you, I mean me. But regardless, like everything else in this world, horror is subjective. But what isn't subjective is the feeling you get while watching a good horror film. The adrenaline rush you get as you anticipate a jump scare just for it not to happen. With this video, I hope you realize the importance of a good horror story and how investing time and effort into characters and the world instead of jump scares and character design can create a horror story that can leave a lasting impression forever. Okay guys, thanks for watching the video. I spent some time on this video, but hopefully I should have this out on holiday day, if not probably November 1st. So obviously, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like rating, I would really appreciate it. And if you're new here, if you could hit that subscribe button, it really does help out the channel. And a little update with the channel. So I finished, or should be finished, with Ghost of Tsushima by the time the video comes out. And I'll have a full in-depth review around maybe next week, hopefully, no promises. But I want to thank everyone who's been stopping by watching the videos lately. I like the direction the channel's heading, so it'll be cool to see where everything goes. Anyways, my name is Quasi, and this was just a game.